Hello friends, this is Worm, and it's Tuesday, so it's time we revive a little bit of an older series on the channel here called Hot Take Tuesday, where we take a look at some potentially spicy takes from Destiny 2, talk about the pros and cons of them, stuff like that. And in today's video, I want to ask the question, should Bungie allow players to have access to all content solo? Meaning, should players basically be allowed to turn off matchmaking in things like strikes, activities such as seasonal activities, Dares of Eternity, stuff like that? Should Bungie allow people to do that solo completely? And this is not really a new argument by any means. Like this has been talked about for a long time in the Destiny 2 community, and we see, hardcore players, they run solo stuff all the time, and Bungie does to some degree allow players to run solo content, and they do this through the addition of legend activities, or they have a new name now. What is it, like expert activities and master activities, stuff like that. But of course, we're talking about across the game. If you want to play a game solo, if you want to do just any random strike solo at its base level, should Bungie allow players to do that? So I've got some pros and cons in a list here, and I want to talk about each of those. And of course, we'll start with the pros of allowing players to play without matchmaking, do everything solo. And the biggest pro in my eyes is that it challenges players to a new degree. There are a lot of Destiny 2 players, and there are several hundred, maybe, Destiny 2 players that do difficult content solo, right? Solo Grandmaster, solo Master, stuff like that. But I think that there's a gap between those two players, because the players that are able to do that high level content as a solo player have really refined their builds. They've really practiced a lot, practiced hard. And the players that don't participate in solo difficult activities, they haven't quite had that push yet into there. And I think that perhaps if Bungie allowed players to do strikes, for example, solo, just a basic level strike, no crazy modifiers, no power deficits, anything like that, it would give players a new challenge that they could rise to. Then you could take that new challenge and move up the ladder. You start with, let's just say, Exodus down, right? That's the strike, one of the Nightfalls this season. You start with Exodus down. Okay, do it at its base level solo, practice it, run it through a couple times, then graduate to the Nightfall variant, the base level Nightfall, but do it without matchmaking. Then you can kind of move up from there once you start feeling comfortable. It's a big jump to go from doing a regular strike as a team, or even a base level Nightfall strike as a team, to going to the next level difficulty solo. And I think that if Bungie allowed players to have the ability to, move up that ladder a little bit more gently, you would see a lot more challenge opened up to Destiny 2. You'd see a lot more players take advantage of that, and you would potentially see a lot of refined builds. And it really opens the ability to increase skill across the board. And that's actually the next point here. When you are allowing players to refine their builds and fine tune, start at a regular strike on regular difficulty and then move up from there, all while solo, you're giving players the ability to refine their build. Like, oh, hey, I've got this Arc Hunter build, it's really good, but maybe if I switch this out for this, and if I do this and this and this and this, and all of a sudden you have a perfected build for that Arc Hunter. Then you can move on to, Solar Hunter, Void Hunter, then Warlock, Titan, whatever. You can fine tune these builds. And of course, one of the big things about Destiny I notice when I'm playing in just standard activity, lots of players, they don't have fine tuned builds. I was playing on support. I was playing a support build Warlock the other night, just doing some random stuff, base level Nightfalls, seasonal activities and stuff. And I was getting the most kills and the highest scores every single time as a support player. Like, I was using no hesitation. I'm using speaker sight. Like, I'm using a full-on support build, and I was absolutely wrecking everything. And so if Bungie allowed players to do stuff solo, it would give players more of a push to get in there, try something solo, try this, strike, for example, this easy, not too difficult strike solo, fine tune your build and climb that ability up from there. But not only does it give players the ability to refine their skill, but it also opens up a new play style. I mean, obviously, most players, I think, in Destiny 2 play for themselves. Like, the most powerful builds in Destiny 2 are typically builds that have sustainability as a solo player. But it also, if you're in a raid, for example, or you're in a strike and you're with 3 other people that have, these incredible builds, blah, 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 things can kind of slow down a lot. So it gives players a chance to not only refine their refine their build, but also give just a new play style, as a Warlock, for example. When I play on Warlock, I am 90% of the time playing some sort of support-based build. But if I had access to do more solo activities, I would move away from those support builds and give myself, a try out Strand Warlock, for example, a Threadling build, or try out, some different Void builds other than Briar Binds or something like that. So it opens the possibility of having new play styles for players. But the last pro that I want to talk about here is it would also allow more extensive testing of loadouts. And this kind of circles back to the previous one that we talked about with, increasing your or fine-tuning your build and stuff like that. But if you have the ability to extensively test loadouts, like that's going to be what refines your build. If you want to say a hazardous propulsion Titan build, you can go into solo content, you can go into solo strikes, just regular old solo strikes, test out where that build is strongest, where it's weakest. Is it weakest in ad clear? Is it weakest in boss damage? And again, fine tune that loadout so that you can have a perfected build. And so that's kind of the pros that I think about when I think of, okay, like if Bungie were to remove matchmaking or give players the ability to remove themselves from matchmaking. But there's also cons to removing yourself from matchmaking. And one of the biggest cons at hand, and this is obviously more of like a personal thing, but it's the fact that Destiny 2 is a social game and it's designed to be played best with others. It's not personally fun to me to play in solo content very much. Like, Lost Sectors, for example, are fine. If I'm doing some other, stuff, like if I'm exploring the Pale Heart, like that's all fine. But most of the time I want to be playing with other people's. Now, again, this is a personal preference of mine. Like if you don't share that, that's totally fine. But it also kind of breaks the lore. And again, I know a lot of people aren't going to care about lore, but it does break the lore. Like the lore of the Guardians is that they stand together against the forces of darkness. And if you're allowing players just jump into anything solo, that's kind of breaking the lore. But again, that's a very biased, very personal, negative side for me. Let's talk about some more that are more tangible for everybody. So the first issue that I can see happening is that if you allow solo content, like we saw with Dual Destiny, okay, Dual Destiny required you to get literally with just one other person and do it. And so many players complained, they wanted to do it solo. They didn't want to, talk to people. I don't know, just want to be antisocial, blah, blah, blah. But if you allow this to happen in every single aspect of the game, you are lowering your player count inside of those team-based activities. So let's take, for example, you have Nightfalls, right? And the base level is matchmaking. Well, now you allow yourself to be removed from matchmaking. So you can do it at its base level solo. What that does is that decreases the amount of players that can matchmake with people who actually want to play as a team. People who actually want to participate in the Nightfall, not just to test their challenge, but to actually go for loot and stuff like that. And when you start putting stress on that increases your queue times. And we've seen what that looks like, especially if you're like a high level comp player in the Crucible, like what it looks like to wait for like 5-10 minutes for a match to start. Like that's completely ridiculous. And of course, if you're allowing more and more players to get in and do solo content, solo strikes, solo, activities like Dares of Eternity and stuff like that, like you're just lowering the number of people that can potentially be match made together. Then you also run into the issue of, okay, well, we're having to constantly expand our matchmaking bounds to a point where I'm playing with somebody who's, in South America or who's in China or something, and they're lagging really, really bad, and it's taking away from my experience because they're just rubber banding all over the place. And even though it's probably PvE activity, they're still rubber banding around the place. They're walking and they're right in front of me, then they're not. It's distracting and it's frustrating. And especially if you're trying to do like a support build, which we're gonna talk about support builds in just a second. But if you're trying to do a support build, it can be frustrating to throw a healing grenade at somebody and then they rubber band away, so your healing grenade just hits nothing. Okay, and so that's one of the more tangible issues of having matchmaking be open to everything. But moving on from there, it can also force players into situations and loadouts and builds that aren't optimized for whatever content. Again, if you're taking everybody who's running super strong solo builds and allowing them to do solo content, what are you leaving in the matchmaking pool? You're leaving support builds. You're leaving players that, have a more supportive role. Maybe they're using No Hesitation and they're trying to rely on No Hesitation for their build. Maybe they're using Imbra Benevolence. Maybe they're using, Bastion, and they're trying to get utility out of their build, which is no problem by any means. But at the same time, when you have 3 people who are all using a support build, you're sacrificing your damage, your DPS, your ad clear, things have to be sacrificed when you're dealing with support builds. Okay, look at the strongest builds in the game. Almost none of them are support builds, with the exception of maybe Solar Warlock, but even Solar Warlock depends on having other people around you. And so if you allow players to go into this content solo, you run into the issue of more and more, say, support players being grouped up with one another. Then people have to switch their loadouts, and most people don't switch their loadouts. If we're being just completely honest, they're in there to test a certain loadout. That's what they want to use. They don't want to switch from Solar to Strand, or from Strand to Void, or anything like that. Like they're there to do a specific thing. And of course, when you're lowering the number of plausible teammates that can, be supported by a support player because they're over in solo queue, that's kind of an issue that I could see happening. Now, another thing, and again, this is a much more physical issue that I actually, full disclosure, I don't know very much about it, but that is the server issue. Destiny 2 is not an offline game. In an offline game, you can play stuff solo and have no effect on the server because you're playing offline. You're not uploading any data to the server. The server doesn't have to store any information or anything like that. But with Destiny 2 and the way it's designed to be an online game, it has to store data on servers. So if you have an influx of players that are running into various strikes and stuff solo, it's having to make a new instance for every single one of those players. And if that happens, you could potentially see the servers being overloaded, maybe see queue times into certain strikes or stuff like that. And again, I don't know exactly how all this works. If you know how the matchmaking works and you know the effect that allowing solo players to do whatever they want would have on it, please tell me in the comments. Please, help me get that sorted out, because this is all speculations. But I think that you could potentially see an issue with the servers if you have just more and more people jumping into solo content. And again, like we saw with Dual Destiny, there's a lot of people in Destiny 2 that would rather do things as a solo player. But moving on to the next one, this one is, again, kind of in regards to the builds, but that is if you allow players to do solo content. Bungie allows players to do solo content, and they get in there and they refine and they perfect their builds. When you do get to a point where you have to do a team activity such as a raid or something, everybody's build is refined around probably ad clear. Let's be honest, Strand Titan might be one exception to that, because Strand Titan is great for basically every aspect of the game. But in most cases, you're going to have players that are, focusing on probably ad clear. What's the most refined ad clear I can have with boss DPS on top of it? And if you have players in here with these top tier builds and their top tier, play styles and stuff like that, and you have, say, 3 of y'all together doing a strike, there is going to be a major power struggle between the 3 of y'all. Who can get the most kills? I mean, I don't know about y'all, but in that description I had earlier, whenever I'm using a support build, I'm playing a support, I'm getting the most kills in, say, the Breach executable. We'll just use that example. In Breach executable, I'm getting the most kills as a support build. I'm getting the most, the highest score. Sorry, I couldn't think for a second. I'm getting the most kills, getting the highest score, stuff like that. If I were to put on, say, Strand Titan and put on my full Strand build, and I got 2 other Strand Titans in there with me, like, how much fun is it really gonna be when we're all just struggling to get kills? Like a group of enemy walks out and I just instantly nuke that entire group of enemy. And my 2 teammates are standing around. Then all of a sudden they spawn over close to another one, and then that teammate nukes that group. And then it's like kind of a stalemate of like, okay, this is kind of boring. And we've seen content that is kind of boring. I mean, look at Season of the Plunder, that I can't remember the name of the activity, but the 6-man activity where you boarded the catch. That first part where you're on the first catch was great because there was plenty of enemies, but once you moved in that second room, it was really dry, and you had players that had the potential of destroying absolutely everything in the room and nuking everything right as it spawns, and players are just basically left around to just stand there and do nothing. That's not a fun playstyle. And of course, if you allow more players to refine their builds through solo content, you're going to encounter more and more of that. Right along the lines with that, and this is kind of the last con that I had for allowing players to, get out of matchmaking. It just further separates players from teamwork. And I'm going to pull up an example here that I think most hardcore Destiny players are going to agree with. That is the corrupted strike. How many times have you joined a corrupted strike and you're trying to throw the ball at somebody, or somebody picks up the ball and they don't throw it back to you, blah, 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 blah. Like, this is one of the reasons why raids will never have matchmaking, because players will not know what to do. And obviously, you're in matchmaking currently in the corrupted and you're struggling. Why not just do it solo? if you take away the ability for players to do it solo, people just won't learn mechanics. I am fully convinced that the reason why the Corrupted is so frustrating with, you know, random teammates is because those teammates never learned back in, I think it was Forsaken, right? They never learned back in Forsaken that throwing the ball to a teammate will actually increase its damage and allow you to break the shield in one shot. And if you allow players to do everything solo, at what point do you know, have the ability to tell players, hey, like, you pass the ball to me and I'll be fine? Let's say they introduce a new mechanic where, you know, you have to hold something for 5 seconds and then drop it, and then your teammate has to hold it for 5 seconds and drop it. If you're doing that solo, you hold it for 5 seconds and then do whatever it is you got to do with it, it's going to do that flat damage, it's going to do that flat thing. But if you, of course, allow your teammate to hold it and then your other teammate to hold it, so on and so forth, like, you'll get whatever it is you're trying to do done faster. But if you, again, players are allowed to do things solo, people just won't learn about that mechanic or how to do that specific thing. So it makes it more difficult on the people that are trying to do teamwork to understand that. I mean, for example, look at Breach Executable this season. So many people skip the piston hammer thing for the little, I can't even remember what they're called, the radiolites. Right? So many people, as soon as that second encounter's done, they just rush to the portal and go to the boss. That is super frustrating to everybody. Now imagine if all those players that do that play solo and they never had to ever learn what the piston hammer does or anything. Then all of a sudden you get, you know, a master mode where you have to have teammates or else it's going to be too difficult. These players don't know to activate that piston hammer. And so you activate it, and as soon as you activate it, you're teleported into the boss room and you miss out on all that radiolite. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. When you separate players from teamwork, you will have difficulty in teaching players in the future. Like I said, with the Corrupted Strike, that's exactly what happened. Because when the Corrupted Strike first came out, and it was, I believe it was a story mission, you were literally told, toss the ball to somebody else and it will increase its damage. Now, if you go play the Corrupted, there's no indication of that. So of course, players just pick up the ball and throw it at the boss. Why would they throw it at a teammate? And yeah, like, you know, maybe they see the teammates throwing it to each other, but it doesn't necessarily click until you actually know why you're passing the ball. But with that being said, that's the cons I have. We talked about the pros of allowing players to get out of matchmaking. We talked about the cons of allowing players to get out of matchmaking and do solo content. I want to know what your thoughts are on allowing players to play in content as a solo player. All content across the game. Strikes, breach executables, you know, dares of eternity, like anything that you want to do at its base level, you can just say, opt out of matchmaking. Like, how do you feel about that? Do you think Bungie should do it? Do you think Bungie shouldn't? Do you have any ideas of why they should or why they shouldn't that I did not talk about in this video? Leave me all that stuff in the comments. Of course, guys, if you enjoyed today's video, drop a like, helps the channel out a lot. Subscribe for more daily Destiny content, and do me a favor, watch the videos you see here on the end screen, because for whatever reason, YouTube thinks you will like them. We'll see you on the next one. Bye for now, guys.